The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when James Richardson arrived at Atlanta International Airport. At 65, he moved with the confident stride of someone who had spent 3 decades serving in the Air Force. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and he wore his favorite navy blue blazer, the one his son had given him last Father's Day. Today was supposed to be a special day. After months of planning, James was finally flying to Los Angeles to surprise his son, who had recently been appointed as a federal judge. The thought brought a warm smile to his face as he made his way through the airport's busy terminals. James had always loved airports. They reminded him of his years in service, flying missions across the globe. But these days, as a retired veteran, he enjoyed a different kind of flying, one that came with the perks of his veteran status, including occasional first-class upgrades. As he approached the Delta Airlines check-in counter, James pulled out his military ID along with his ticket information. The young man behind the counter, whose name tag read Mike, greeted him with genuine respect. "Good morning, sir. I see you're traveling to Los Angeles today," Mike said, typing away at his computer. His eyes lit up when he noticed James's military ID. "Thank you for your service. Let me check if we can make your journey more comfortable." After a few clicks, Mike's smile widened. "You're in luck, sir. We have a first-class upgrade available for you today, thanks to your veteran status. Would you like that?" James nodded gratefully. In his 30 years of service, he had never sought special treatment, but these small gestures of appreciation always touched his heart. "That's very kind of you, thank you," he replied warmly. The security checkpoint was surprisingly smooth for a busy Thursday morning. James had mastered the art of efficient travel, laptop in an easy-to-reach pocket, no belt to remove, and slip-on shoes that made the whole process breeze by. Several TSA agents nodded respectfully when they saw his veteran status on his ID. Walking to Gate B23, James stopped at a small cafe to grab his morning coffee. The barista, an elderly woman with kind eyes, reminded him of his late wife. She noticed his Air Force veteran cap and insisted on giving him a free pastry with his coffee. "My husband served too," she said with pride in her voice. "Take care of yourself up there today." James found a quiet spot near his gate and settled in with his coffee and Danish. He pulled out his phone to look at recent pictures of his son. The boy, though hardly a boy anymore at 45, had made him proud beyond words. From humble beginnings to federal judge, his son's journey was a testament to hard work and determination. As boarding time approached, James watched families rushing by, business people talking on phones, and fellow travelers from all walks of life converging at the gate. Flight DL 2387 to Los Angeles was starting to gather its passengers, and the gate area buzzed with pre-flight activity. "Now boarding our first-class passengers and active-duty military," the gate agent announced cheerfully. James gathered his belongings and made his way to the jet bridge. The gate agent smiled warmly, thanking him for his service as she scanned his boarding pass. Walking down the jet bridge, James felt the familiar excitement of flying. The aircraft smell, the subtle vibration under his feet, the sound of the auxiliary power unit, it all brought back memories of his service days. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant named Karen Walsh greeted passengers with what seemed like a practiced smile. However, when James approached, showing his boarding pass for seat 3A, her smile noticeably faltered. Her greeting became curt, almost dismissive, as she gestured vaguely toward his seat. James didn't let it bother him. In his 65 years, he had encountered all types of people and learned that kindness was the best response to any situation. He made his way to his seat, carefully stored his carry-on in the overhead bin, and settled into the comfortable first-class accommodation. The pre-flight routine continued around him. Other passengers filed in, flight attendants prepared the cabin, and the familiar announcements played overhead. James noticed Walsh moving through the first-class cabin, helping other passengers store their bags and taking pre-departure drink orders from everyone except him. A young businessman in the seat next to James noticed this too. He gave James a concerned look but didn't say anything. James simply smiled and pulled out the magazine from the seat pocket, flipping through its pages while quietly observing the unfolding scene. Through the window, he could see ground crew members loading luggage and performing their pre-flight checks. The morning sun now painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, promising a beautiful day for flying. James thought about how his son would react to his surprise visit. They had talked just yesterday, and he had managed to keep his travel plans secret. As the final passengers boarded and the doors closed, James noticed Walsh giving him occasional glances, not the professional, caring looks she gave other first-class passengers, but something different, something that made him slightly uncomfortable. Still, he maintained his composure, reminding himself of the countless times he'd faced far more challenging situations during his military career. The safety demonstration began, and James dutifully paid attention, despite having seen it hundreds of times before. He noticed Walsh performing her part of the demonstration with professional precision for most of the cabin, but when she reached his section, her movements became rushed and impersonal. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, James closed his eyes and said a small prayer, a habit he'd developed during his flying days. He thought about the day ahead, about his son's achievement, about the proud moment they would share when he surprised him at his chambers. Little did James know that this routine flight would become anything but routine. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, he couldn't have imagined how the next few hours would unfold, or how his simple trip to visit his son would become a powerful story of dignity in the face of discrimination, and ultimately, justice served. The engines roared to life, and Flight DL 2387 began its takeoff roll, carrying with it not just passengers and crew, but also the beginning of a story that would soon capture national attention and spark an important conversation about respect, equality, and human dignity in American skies. The flight had reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. James Richardson adjusted his seat slightly, looking forward to the drink service that usually followed. Around him, other first-class passengers were already closing their laptop screens and settling in for the comfortable journey ahead. Flight attendant Walsh began her drink service from the front of the first-class cabin. She moved with practiced efficiency, greeting each passenger with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, what can I get you today?" she asked the businessman in 1A, who requested a coffee with cream. James watched as she methodically worked her way through the cabin, serving each passenger with professional courtesy. The businessman next to him in 3B ordered a sparkling water with lime. But when Walsh reached their row, something strange happened. She served the businessman his drink, then turned and walked away without even glancing in James's direction. At first, James thought it might have been an oversight. After 30 years in the Air Force, he had learned to give people the benefit of the doubt. He waited patiently, thinking she would return. The ice cubes clanked in his seatmate's glass, a subtle reminder of his own growing thirst. A few minutes passed, and Walsh returned to check on other passengers. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked a woman in 2C. James raised his hand politely, trying to catch her attention. Walsh looked right through him as if he were invisible and continued down the aisle. The businessman next to him shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's not right," he muttered under his breath, then pressed his call button. Walsh returned promptly, her professional smile firmly in place. "Yes, sir?" "I think you missed my seatmate here," the businessman said, gesturing toward James. Walsh's smile tightened. "I'll be back," she said curtly, but she didn't return. A young woman in the row behind James had been watching the situation unfold. She leaned forward and spoke softly. "Sir, would you like me to try?" James turned and saw genuine concern in her eyes. He smiled gently. "That's very kind of you," he replied, "but it's all right." But it wasn't all right, and other passengers were starting to notice. A quiet murmur of discontent spread through the first-class cabin. An elderly couple across the aisle exchanged worried glances. The businessman next to James pulled out his phone and, trying to be discreet, started recording the ongoing situation. 20 minutes later, Walsh made another pass through the cabin with fresh drinks. This time, James spoke up directly. "Excuse me, miss." His voice was polite but firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded troops. "I haven't been served yet." Walsh paused, then spoke in a tone that could freeze water. "I'm very busy right now. You'll have to wait." The cabin grew eerily quiet. The contrast between her treatment of James and other passengers was now impossible to ignore. The young woman behind James pressed her call button again. When Walsh returned, the woman spoke firmly. "This gentleman hasn't been served any drinks since takeoff. Could you please take his order?" Walsh's face flushed red. "I'll get to everyone in due time," she snapped, then stormed off toward the galley. The young woman apologized to James, clearly embarrassed by the flight attendant's behavior. "Don't worry about it," James said softly. "I've seen this before." His voice carried no bitterness, only a tired familiarity that made several nearby passengers look down at their hands, uncomfortable with the reality of what they were witnessing. An hour into the flight, other flight attendants had noticed the tension in first class. A younger flight attendant, noticing James hadn't been served, approached with a water bottle. But before she could hand it to him, Walsh appeared and stopped her. "I'm handling this section," she said sharply, causing the younger attendant to retreat apologetically. The businessman next to James had finished his drink long ago. He removed his earbuds and turned to James. "This is unacceptable," he said. "I've been flying first class for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this." James nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes people show you who they are," he said quietly. "The important thing is how you respond." His words carried the weight of decades of experience, of countless similar situations handled with dignity. More passengers were now openly watching the situation. A woman in business attire had taken out her phone and was typing rapidly, likely composing an email to the airline. The elderly couple across the aisle had called for the lead flight attendant, who was nowhere to be seen. Walsh made another pass through the cabin, this time with snacks. She placed packets of almonds on each first-class tray table, except for James's. When she reached his row, she deliberately pulled back the snack basket, making it clear the omission was intentional. The businessman beside James had had enough. "This is discrimination, plain and simple," he announced, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Other passengers nodded in agreement. Someone in the back of first class called out, "Get the captain." James remained calm, his hands folded in his lap. His military training had taught him that losing your cool never improved a situation. But there was something in his eyes, not anger, but a quiet determination. He had faced worse challenges in his life and had emerged stronger. This would be no different. The tension in the cabin was building like a thunderstorm. Passengers were shifting in their seats, exchanging looks, and checking their phones, perhaps documenting what they were witnessing. The contrast between James's dignified silence and Walsh's obvious hostility made the situation even more dramatic. A small group of passengers had gathered near the galley, presumably trying to speak with other crew members about the situation. Their whispered conversations carried tones of indignation and disbelief. Through it all, James sat quietly, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and calm demeanor. Little did Walsh know that her discriminatory behavior was about to backfire spectacularly. As the confrontation approached its boiling point, none of the passengers, least of all Walsh herself, could have predicted how this situation would escalate, or the shocking revelation that would turn this routine flight into a powerful story of justice and consequences. 2 hours into the flight, James Richardson felt the familiar pressure in his bladder that reminded him of his age. He had been sitting quietly, still without any service, watching the clouds drift by through the window. The time had come when he needed to use the restroom, a simple human need that was about to trigger an unimaginable escalation. James waited for a moment when the aisle was clear. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. The businessman next to him shifted to make room, giving him an encouraging nod. As James stood up, his knees cracked slightly, a reminder of his years of military service. The first-class bathroom was just a few steps ahead, past where Walsh stood arranging items on her service cart. As James approached, Walsh's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. She immediately moved to block the narrow aisle, pushing her cart to create a barrier. "Sir, the seatbelt sign is on," Walsh said sharply. Several passengers looked up, confused. The seatbelt sign had been off for hours. The businessman who had been recording earlier quickly pulled out his phone again. "Ma'am," James replied softly, his voice steady, "the sign is off, and I need to use the restroom." He gestured politely toward the bathroom, maintaining his composure despite the growing discomfort. Walsh's voice rose, carrying through the cabin. "You need to return to your seat immediately. You're being aggressive." The accusation hung in the air, shocking the other passengers. James hadn't raised his voice or made any threatening moves. He had simply stood in the aisle, speaking calmly. A middle-aged woman in 2D stood up. "That's not true. He's done nothing wrong." Other passengers joined in, their voices a chorus of support for James. Someone toward the back of first class shouted, "We're all watching this." The elderly couple across the aisle had their phones out now, recording the interaction. The wife's hands trembled slightly as she held her phone, but her gaze was steady and determined. Her husband reached over with his free hand and squeezed her shoulder, both of them witnessing what they knew was blatant discrimination. James remained still, his military training evident in his controlled response to the situation. "Ma'am," he tried again, "I just need to use the restroom. I'll be quick and return to my seat." Walsh's face had turned an angry red. "You're disrupting the flight," she insisted, her voice getting louder. "I'll have to report this to the captain." A few passengers gasped at the absurdity of her claim. The young flight attendant who had tried to bring James water earlier stood at the back of the cabin, looking distressed and uncertain. The businessman who had been recording stood up. "I have everything on video," he announced clearly, "including the fact that you haven't served this gentleman once during the entire flight." Other passengers nodded, some holding up their own phones to indicate they too had been documenting the situation. James took a small step to the side, trying to navigate around the cart while maintaining a respectful distance from Walsh. His movement was slow and non-threatening, yet Walsh reacted as if he had charged at her. "Don't come any closer," she practically shouted, causing several passengers to jump in their seats. A baby in business class started crying, picking up on the tension in the air. The young mother tried to quiet her child while shooting concerned glances toward the commotion in first class. More passengers were standing now, their phones recording the scene. The young woman behind James had tears in her eyes, a mix of anger and disbelief on her face. "This is horrible," she whispered to her seatmate. "He's done absolutely nothing wrong." The lead flight attendant finally appeared, drawn by the commotion. She took in the scene, James standing calmly in the aisle, Walsh blocking his path, and a cabin full of passengers recording everything on their phones. "What's going on here?" she asked, trying to take control of the situation. Before anyone could answer, Walsh spoke rapidly. "This passenger is being aggressive and refusing to follow crew member instructions." The absurdity of her claim was met with immediate protests from the surrounding passengers. "That's a lie," called out the elderly man across the aisle. "We've all been watching. This gentleman has been nothing but polite, while she's been discriminating against him since takeoff." The lead flight attendant looked uncertain, glancing between Walsh and the numerous passengers who were now speaking up in James's defense. The young flight attendant who had tried to help earlier stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said quietly to her superior, "Mr. Richardson hasn't been served at all during this flight. I tried to bring him water, but—" James stood quietly through all of this, his dignity intact despite the humiliating situation. His years of military service had taught him how to handle high-pressure situations with grace, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield or a military crisis. This was simply a man trying to use the bathroom on a commercial flight. The businessman who had been recording turned to the lead flight attendant. "I suggest you review my footage before making any decisions. I'm an executive with a major corporation, and I'm prepared to testify about what I've witnessed today." Other passengers joined in, offering their own recordings and testimonies. The first-class cabin had become a courtroom of sorts, with Walsh's behavior on trial and a jury of passengers ready to deliver their verdict. The tension in the cabin was reaching a breaking point. Nobody knew it yet, but this confrontation was about to take an even more dramatic turn, one that would make Walsh deeply regret her actions and transform this incident from a simple case of discrimination into a story that would capture national attention. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had become electric with tension. James Richardson still stood in the aisle, his need to use the restroom now urgent after hours without any beverage service. The lead flight attendant looked overwhelmed by the situation, while Walsh continued to block the path with her service cart, her body language growing more aggressive by the moment. "Please," James said quietly, his voice carrying the patience of a man who had faced far greater challenges, "I just need to use the restroom. That's all." He took another small step to the side, trying to find a path around the cart while keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. The elderly woman across the aisle had tears in her eyes as she continued recording. Her husband held her free hand tightly, both of them watching with a mix of sadness and disbelief. The businessman next to James's seat stood steady, his phone capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, witnessed by dozens of passengers and captured on multiple phones. As James attempted to squeeze past the cart, maintaining as much distance as possible from Walsh, she suddenly moved. Without warning, her arm shot out, and her closed fist struck James in the chest. The impact wasn't severe. James was a strong man, even at 65, but the intentional nature of the act sent shockwaves through the cabin. Several passengers gasped. The young mother in business class quickly covered her child's eyes. The businessman recording everything let out an audible, "Oh my God." James staggered back slightly, more from surprise than pain. His military training kicked in automatically, not to fight back, but to maintain his balance and composure. He raised his hands slowly, palms forward, making it clear to everyone watching that he posed no threat. "Did everyone see that?" The elderly man called out, his voice shaking with anger. "She just assaulted this gentleman." Multiple voices responded with, "I got it on video, and we all saw it." The young flight attendant who had tried to help earlier rushed forward, positioning herself between Walsh and James. "Karen, stop," she pleaded with her colleague. "This has gone too far." The lead flight attendant finally snapped into action. "Walsh, step back immediately," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority that had been missing earlier. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked James, genuine concern in her voice. James nodded slowly, one hand rubbing his chest where Walsh had struck him. "I'm fine," he said calmly, though his eyes reflected the disappointment of someone who had seen this kind of behavior too many times before. The businessman who had been recording rushed to the galley and pressed the call button for the captain. "We need the captain here now," he insisted to another flight attendant. "This is assault. It's a federal crime." Walsh seemed to realize the gravity of what she had done. Her face, which had been flushed with anger, suddenly drained of color. She started backing away, bumping into her service cart. "He was threatening me," she tried to claim, but her voice wavered as dozens of passengers immediately shouted their disagreement. "We all saw what happened. He never threatened anyone. You're the only threat here." The voices of outraged passengers filled the cabin. The young woman behind James's seat was openly crying now, her hands shaking as she lowered her phone. "I can't believe this is happening in 2025, she said, her voice breaking. "This is exactly what my grandparents told me about, and it's still happening." James remained standing, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and controlled breathing. He had faced enemy fire during his service years, but this kind of attack, unprovoked, based purely on prejudice, carried a different kind of sting. The sound of the cockpit door opening cut through the chaos. The captain emerged, his face serious as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding aircraft and crew. Several passengers began speaking at once, but the businessman with the phone stepped forward. "Sir, I have clear video evidence of your flight attendant assaulting this passenger, a military veteran, after discriminating against him for the entire flight." The captain's expression darkened as he turned to the lead flight attendant. "Is this true?" The lead flight attendant nodded grimly, explaining how Walsh had refused to serve James and then escalated the situation. As the truth of the situation became clear to the captain, Walsh's demeanor changed dramatically. The arrogance she had displayed earlier melted away, replaced by obvious fear. She knew that assaulting a passenger was grounds for immediate termination and possible criminal charges. The business class passengers had grown quiet, straining to hear what was happening in first class. The story would spread throughout the plane soon enough, passed from row to row in whispered conversations and shocked expressions. The captain turned to James, genuine respect in his voice. "Sir, I apologize for what you've experienced on our flight today. Please know that this behavior does not reflect our airline's values." He then turned to Walsh, his voice stern. "You're relieved of duty immediately. Go gather your belongings." As Walsh was escorted to the back of the plane by the lead flight attendant, the young flight attendant finally stepped forward to help James. "Sir, please let me show you to the restroom. And can I get you anything to drink? I'm so sorry about all of this." The other passengers watched with a mix of emotions, relief that justice was being served, anger at what they had witnessed, and admiration for James's dignity throughout the ordeal. But no one in that cabin, least of all Walsh, could have predicted what would happen next, a revelation that would turn this already shocking incident into a national story about justice, accountability, and the ongoing fight against discrimination in America. The first-class cabin was slowly settling back into an uneasy calm. James Richardson had finally been able to use the restroom and was now sipping the water that the young flight attendant had practically rushed to bring him. Walsh had been relegated to the back of the plane, and the captain had returned to the cockpit after ensuring the situation was under control. The businessman who had recorded everything was reviewing his footage, shaking his head in disbelief. Other passengers were sending texts and emails, sharing what they had witnessed with friends and family. The elderly couple across the aisle had moved to seats closer to James, offering quiet words of support. "You handled that with such grace," the elderly woman said softly. "My husband and I, we've seen too much of this in our lifetime." Her eyes carried the weight of years of similar experiences, a silent understanding passing between them. James smiled gently. "Sometimes the best response to hatred is dignity," he replied. The businessman nearby nodded in agreement, still focused on his phone screen as he typed out what appeared to be a lengthy email. Suddenly, a commotion arose from a few rows back. A passenger had been browsing news on his tablet when something caught his eye. His voice, filled with surprise and recognition, cut through the quiet cabin. "Wait a minute, aren't you Judge Richardson's father?" The cabin grew silent. All eyes turned to James, who sat calmly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The passenger with the tablet stood up, turning it to show others. On the screen was a news article about recently appointed federal judges, featuring a prominent photo of James's son at his swearing-in ceremony. The resemblance between father and son was unmistakable. "Your son, he's the new federal judge?" The young woman behind James asked, her eyes wide with realization. "The one who's been in the news for his work on civil rights cases." James nodded modestly. "That's my boy," he said, pride evident in his voice despite his attempt at understatement. The news spread through the cabin like wildfire, passengers pulling out their phones to search for articles about the younger Richardson. The businessman who had been recording everything let out a low whistle. "Oh man," he said, "this flight attendant just assaulted a federal judge's father, a judge known for handling discrimination cases." He looked at his phone with new appreciation for the significance of what he had recorded. From the back of the plane, where Walsh had been stationed since being relieved of duty, came the sound of something dropping, perhaps a drink cart being bumped in shock. The lead flight attendant, who had been standing nearby, quickly moved to steady it. The elderly man who had supported James throughout the ordeal chuckled softly. "Sometimes justice has a way of coming full circle," he said, patting James's shoulder. "Your son must be doing important work." More passengers were finding articles now, reading aloud snippets about Judge Richardson's recent appointment and his impressive career fighting discrimination. "Listen to this," someone called out. "Judge Richardson's appointment marks a significant step forward in the ongoing fight for equal justice under law." The young flight attendant who had helped James returned with fresh coffee and snacks, her hands trembling slightly as she served him. "Sir," she said quietly, "I had no idea. I'm so sorry about everything that happened." James accepted the coffee with his usual grace. "You have nothing to apologize for," he assured her. "You tried to help earlier when others wouldn't." The young woman's eyes filled with tears as she nodded gratefully. News of James's identity continued to spread throughout the plane. Passengers in business class were turning in their seats, trying to catch a glimpse of him. Someone had already posted about the incident on social media, and phones throughout the cabin were buzzing with notifications as the story began to gain traction. The businessman who had recorded everything was now on his phone, speaking quietly but intensely. "Yes, I have clear video evidence. No, this isn't a joke. Yes, that Judge Richardson, his father, yes, complete discrimination and assault, all on video." In the back of the plane, Walsh had sunk into a jump seat, her face ashen. The reality of what she had done, discriminating against and assaulting the father of a prominent federal judge known for civil rights cases, was clearly sinking in. The lead flight attendant stood nearby, speaking quietly into a phone, presumably updating the airline's ground staff about the situation. A flight attendant from business class had made her way forward, drawn by the commotion. As she learned what had happened, she covered her mouth in shock. "We just got an email last week about enhanced anti-discrimination training," she whispered to her colleague. James remained calm through all of this, accepting the attention with modest dignity. When passengers asked about his son, he spoke with genuine pride but without boasting. "He's always believed in standing up for what's right," he would say simply. "I just try to live by the same principles." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation had become something else entirely, a powerful reminder that justice often works in unexpected ways. Passengers who had witnessed the incident firsthand were now realizing they had been part of something that would likely make headlines across the country. The elderly couple sharing their experience, the businessman with his video evidence, the young woman with her tears of relief, all of them knew that this story wouldn't end with this flight. Judge Richardson's position and reputation meant that this incident would shine a spotlight on the broader issue of discrimination in air travel. As the flight continued toward Los Angeles, passengers began sharing their contact information, knowing they might be called upon as witnesses in what would surely become a high-profile case. Through it all, James sat quietly, sipping his coffee, thinking about his son and the look that would cross his face when he learned what had happened on this flight. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone, how Walsh's discriminatory actions had backfired in the most dramatic way possible. But for James, it was just another example of why his son's work was so important, why the fight for equality and justice had to continue, one case at a time. The remaining 2 hours of the flight took on an almost surreal quality. The news of James Richardson's identity had transformed the first-class cabin into something between a courtroom and a press conference. Passengers who had witnessed the incident were now even more determined to document everything, knowing the significance of what they had seen. The businessman who had recorded the confrontation was organizing the evidence. He had created a group chat with several other passengers where they were sharing their videos and contact information. "The more documentation we have, the better," he explained to those nearby. "This kind of thing needs to stop." The young flight attendant who had tried to help earlier was now providing excellent service to James, bringing him anything he needed. She seemed determined to make up for her colleague's behavior, though James assured her repeatedly that she had nothing to feel bad about. "Would you like another coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice still carrying a hint of nervousness. "Or perhaps something to eat? We have some warm cookies coming out of the oven soon." James accepted the offer with his characteristic grace. "That would be lovely, thank you." He had maintained his dignity throughout the entire ordeal, and now his calm demeanor was having a settling effect on the other passengers. The elderly couple who had moved closer to James were sharing their own stories of discrimination they had witnessed over the years. The wife dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she spoke. "To think, after all these years, we're still seeing this kind of behavior. But at least now there are consequences." The lead flight attendant had made several trips to check on James, each time apologizing profusely for Walsh's behavior. "Sir, I want you to know that we've already contacted our chief of staff. They're waiting at the gate in Los Angeles." Her voice carried both professional concern and personal embarrassment. From the back of the plane, Walsh remained out of sight, but flight attendants who passed through the galley reported that she sat frozen in her jump seat, staring blankly ahead. The reality of her actions, and their consequences, seemed to be hitting her hard. The young woman who had been sitting behind James was on her phone, reading news articles about Judge Richardson. "Listen to this," she said to those around her. "Your son has handled some of the biggest discrimination cases in the country. He's known for being tough but fair." James nodded, a proud smile crossing his face. "He believes in justice, not revenge," he said quietly. He learned that from his mother. His voice softened at the mention of his late wife, and several passengers nearby nodded sympathetically. The businessman who had been recording was now on a call with what sounded like his company's legal department. "Yes, I have clear video of everything. No, there's no question about what happened. Yes, multiple witnesses. The airline staff have been notified. Word of the incident had spread throughout the entire plane. Passengers from business class kept finding excuses to walk past first class, trying to catch a glimpse of James. A flight attendant mentioned that even the pilots were aware of who was on their plane now. The captain made another appearance in the cabin, this time spending several minutes speaking quietly with James. "Sir, I want you to know that we take this extremely seriously," he said, his voice carrying genuine concern. "We have representatives from airline management meeting us at the gate." As they approached Los Angeles, phones throughout the cabin lit up with notifications. Someone had posted about the incident on social media, and it was already gaining traction. #JusticeInTheskis was trending, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination on airlines. The lead flight attendant returned with forms for James to fill out. "These are incident reports, sir," she explained. "But please know that this is just the beginning of our response to this situation." James took the papers with a steady hand, reading each page carefully before signing. The businessman who had been recording everything handed James his business card. "I'm a senior VP at my company," he said firmly. "Whatever you need, testimony, evidence, anything, you have my full support." Other passengers quickly followed suit, passing forward their cards and contact information. The elderly man who had supported James throughout the incident leaned over. "Your son must be proud to have a father like you," he said softly. "The way you handled this situation with such dignity and grace, that speaks volumes." As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with anticipation. Everyone knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The videos were already spreading online, and Judge Richardson's name would ensure this incident received the attention it deserved. The young flight attendant made one final pass through the cabin, ensuring everyone was ready for landing. She paused at James's seat. "Sir," she said quietly, "I just want you to know that most of us aren't like her. We love our jobs because we get to meet people from all walks of life." James reached out and patted her hand gently. "I know that," he said warmly. "One person's actions don't define an entire profession." His words seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders, and she smiled gratefully before moving on. As the plane touched down at LAX, passengers began gathering their belongings, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. They all knew that something important would happen once those aircraft doors opened. The airline management waiting at the gate, the media that had surely gathered by now, the imminent involvement of Judge Richardson, this was just the beginning. James sat calmly in his seat, looking out the window at the California sun. He had come to surprise his son, but now his arrival would make headlines for very different reasons. Yet through it all, he maintained the same quiet dignity that had marked his entire military career and life afterward. The plane taxied to the gate, and passengers could see several official-looking vehicles waiting on the tarmac. The story of Flight 2387 was about to become much bigger than anyone could have imagined, except perhaps Walsh, who remained in the back of the plane, dreading the moment those doors would open. In the weeks that followed the incident on Flight 2387, the story took on a life of its own. The videos recorded by passengers went viral within hours of landing, sparking a national conversation about discrimination in air travel. But what happened next showed how one moment of injustice could lead to lasting positive change. The scene at LAX that day set the tone for everything that followed. As James Richardson stepped off the plane, he was met by a team of airline executives, all wearing grave expressions. The airline's chief operating officer had flown in specifically to handle the situation, a clear sign of how seriously they were taking the incident. "Mr. Richardson," the CEO said, extending his hand, "we are deeply sorry for what happened today. This is not who we are as an airline." Behind him, Walsh was being escorted to a private room by airport security, her head down, avoiding the cameras that had already gathered at the terminal. The businessman who had recorded everything kept his word. His video evidence, along with footage from other passengers, painted an undeniable picture of what had occurred. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything gave powerful interviews to local news stations, their emotional testimony bringing the reality of discrimination to life for millions of viewers. "We sat there and watched this man, this veteran who served our country for 30 years, being treated like he wasn't even human," the elderly woman said in one interview, tears in her eyes. But he showed us what real strength looks like. He showed us how to face hatred with dignity. Judge Richardson's response to learning about the incident became another powerful part of the story. He had been in his chambers when the news reached him, preparing for an important case. The videos of his father being discriminated against and assaulted hit him hard, but his response reflected the same dignity his father had shown. "This isn't just about my father," he said in a statement that was widely shared across social media. "This is about every person who has ever faced discrimination and stayed silent because they felt powerless. That ends now." The airline's response surprised many. Instead of trying to minimize the incident or hide behind corporate statements, they took decisive action. Walsh was immediately terminated, but that was just the beginning. The airline announced a comprehensive overhaul of their training programs, bringing in civil rights experts to develop new anti-discrimination protocols. The young flight attendant who had tried to help James that day was invited to be part of the team developing these new procedures. Her experience became a teaching moment for other crew members, showing how one person's willingness to stand up against discrimination could make a difference. The businessman who had recorded the incident kept in touch with James, updating him on how the video was being used in corporate training sessions across the country. "Your story is changing how companies think about discrimination," he told James during a phone call. "It's not just about airlines anymore, it's about every industry." The elderly couple who had supported James during the flight became unexpected advocates for change. They appeared on morning shows, sharing their own experiences and discussing how James's dignity in the face of discrimination had inspired them to speak up more often when they witnessed injustice. Judge Richardson used his position to effect systemic change. He worked with airline industry leaders to establish clearer guidelines for handling discrimination complaints. His father's experience became a case study in law schools, teaching future lawyers about the importance of documenting discrimination and holding people accountable. The young woman who had sat behind James that day started a social media campaign called #DignityInFlight, encouraging people to share their own stories and stand up against discrimination in all its forms. The hashtag trended for weeks, creating a platform for voices that had previously gone unheard. James himself remained humble throughout it all. When asked about the incident in interviews, he always turned the conversation toward the bigger picture. "This isn't about me," he would say. "It's about making sure our children and grandchildren don't have to face the same battles we did." The airline's new training program became a model for the industry. Other airlines began adopting similar procedures, leading to a broader conversation about discrimination in travel. Flight attendants across different airlines reported feeling better equipped to handle similar situations and more empowered to stand up against discriminatory behavior. 6 months after the incident, James was invited to speak at the airline's annual staff training conference. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of flight attendants, he shared a message of hope rather than anger. "We all have a choice in how we respond to hatred," he told them. "We can let it make us bitter, or we can let it make us better. Today, I see people choosing to be better, and that gives me hope for the future." The story's impact continued to ripple outward. Schools began using the incident as a teaching tool in civics classes. Corporate training programs incorporated it into their diversity modules. Law enforcement agencies studied it as an example of how to maintain composure in tense situations. 1 year after the flight, James and his son established a foundation dedicated to fighting discrimination in public spaces. The foundation provided legal support to victims of discrimination and worked with companies to improve their training and response procedures. The final piece of justice came when Walsh, who had initially tried to defend her actions, issued a public apology. She had gone through extensive counseling and anti-bias training, and her statement acknowledged the deep harm her actions had caused. "Mr. Richardson's dignity in the face of my prejudice taught me more than any training course ever could," she wrote. "I will spend the rest of my life working to be worthy of the forgiveness I don't deserve." The story of Flight 2387 became more than just another viral video or news headline. It became a reminder that change is possible, that dignity is powerful, and that justice, when properly served, can transform not just one moment of discrimination, but an entire system that allows such discrimination to exist.